Why do protests seem less effective today than they did just a few short years ago? Thousands of people on the streets, marching, yet nothing actually seems to change. Could it be that what we see as protests are really stage-managed events, designed with another motive in mind? And what of the idea that it is individuals who make a difference? Has this once proud truth been subsumed by those who seek collective action in the name of the state? We'll be looking into all of this and a whole lot more on The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Welcome to The Rabbit Hole. We see protests all around us. These supposedly spontaneous outpourings of anger or resentment, aimed like a laser sight against the powerful by those who have no voices. But is this the reality? Is it really the case that groups of people coming together to decry a policy, a person, a position, or a president can really create a change engine? Or is something else at work? The Western world has achieved its prominence through acts of individuals. The rugged individualism has driven the evolution of society and economy, and even our moral measures, more so than a collective response ever could. So why is the idea that protests must be a group affair become so prevalent in our media and mindset? I want to make an argument today, and this argument points us towards the proposition that those who hold the power right now actually want us to protest in groups. They want us to share our agency in such a way that it weakens the impact of the protest rather than amplifies it. And that those who insist on creating mass movements are really doing the bidding, perhaps unbeknownst, of those who seek to protect their precarious power and the status quo. We're going to be looking at two facets of this idea today. Eventually they'll both tie in together, but let me just outline the two parts for you first. The initial idea I want to talk about is how, contrary to what the masses of virtue-signalling protesters may believe, an effective protest requires some sacrifice to be of use. In fact, I'm going to set out the case that there is a direct correlation between the efficacy of a protest and what the protest costs you as an individual. The second idea is that mass protests are less effective than individual protests, that it is rarely the, quote, movements that achieve real change, but rather the actions of a single person that spark enough outrage or a swelling of popular opinion. I'll keep coming back to these themes as we go along. We have some great stories of courage and some of tragedy that will hopefully illustrate each point, and by the end of the podcast, we'll give you a clearer idea of how protests actually work, or, in fact, don't work. So the first idea, that it is the cost to the individual that directly correlates with how effective the protest is. Here I want to talk about a few individuals and events, many of whom you'll be familiar with. I think a story that really illustrates the power of an individual is that of Mr. Robert Gerard Sands, or Bobby Sands as he was known. Sands was a member of the IRA and directly linked to terrorist attacks. Not by any stretch of the imagination a good guy, but his protest did eventually lead to something positive. While in prison for possession of firearms, Sands got attached to another IRA cause known as the 5 Demands, which were essentially for certain prison rights for IRA prisoners. He protested by going on hunger strike, which ultimately killed him on May 5, 1981, after 66 days. His death did not result in the 5 demands being met, but it did achieve something else. It forced Sinn Féin, the political branch of the IRA, to start becoming a more mainstream political organisation. And this, perhaps more than even the Good Friday Agreement, which was a cessation of hostilities, led to an end of the Troubles. Sands began his hunger strike on March 1st. It seemed that even from the start he was determined to either have his demands met or to die trying. Naturally, his strike began to achieve media attention from all over the world, helped along by the fact that Sands was writing articles and letters, many under a pseudonym. The strike brought him into direct conflict with the Iron Lady herself, Margaret Thatcher. Sands' refusal to eat prompted others to also join in. They started at separate times, and individually, not as a group. Then something happened. The Member of Parliament for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, Frank Maguire, he died, prompting a calling of a by-election. Now, Sinn Féin decided that with Sand's notoriety, they would put him up as a candidate while still in prison. He won by just over 1,000 votes, and at that time became the youngest MP in the House, yet he was not to take his seat. Succumbing to the rigours of the hunger strike and refusing food until the last, he died. Others who had copied his approach also died. With 9 deaths in total, the IRA decided to call off the action, which was at the time regarded as a major victory for Margaret Thatcher. She said of Sands, quote, "Mr. Sands was a convicted criminal. He chose to take his own life. It was a choice that his organisation did not allow to many of its victims." End quote. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one. Sands' death had increased sympathy for the IRA and helped in recruiting, yet this was not the legacy that his protest left behind. Sinn Féin realised that they could now win seats in the British Parliament. This was what eventually led to the end of the IRA as a terrorist organisation. One man's actions, one man's death. Hunger strikes are powerful. They work on the assumption that a civilised society, would not let a person kill themselves in a protracted and painful manner. After 45 days of striking, death is almost certain and expected at any moment, and it's a brutal, harsh death. The history of hunger strikes is thought to go back to the Russian gulags, where prisoners would starve themselves in response to the harsh treatment and conditions. These prisoners were not expecting recognition or publicity, of course, but rather to elicit sympathy from their jailers. In the early 20th century, Marion Wallace Dunlop, a Scottish lady and a suffragette, when arrested for protesting, refused food. This is the first time in history that we have a real record of this kind of protest. She was released just 91 hours after her arrest, as the government began to fear for her health and her safety. Seeing how effective this was, other suffragettes followed her actions. And this brings us to today, the era of collective protests. Would it surprise you to know that in 2017, a group of Yale graduate students organised a well-publicised hunger strike? They were protesting the poor benefits that they receive, which are a $30,000 a year stipend, full health care and their $40,000 tuition paid in full. But of course, they wanted more. So they decided to go on a hunger strike, but with one big difference. This collective hunger strike allowed them to eat. Yes, that's right. It was a hunger strike where they could eat if they got hungry. When one of the group was hungry, another person would step in and take their place so they could go and grab a bite. Now, how effective do you think this protest was? That's right, not at all. And why? Well, simply because there was no sacrifice in what they were doing. Essentially, they missed lunch, unless they chose not to. Like many of the protests we see today, they were attempting, and I use their words, a symbolic protest. And it's the symbolic protests that have become the norm. They're great virtue signals. They get more media traction because of the amount of people, rather than the sacrifice actually being made. Is it any wonder that there have been protests since the day Donald Trump won the election, demanding that he be removed? Millions of people in thousands of marches across the globe. Yet nothing has actually changed because it costs them nothing. Nothing at all. In fact, many of them gain social currency by attending. Without an actual sacrifice on the part of the protester, the impact is negligible. So that's our first point, that the amount of sacrifice made correlates to the impact of the protest. Which brings us on to the second idea, that individual protests, contrary to popular belief, are more effective than mass protests. Let's start by looking at the civil rights marches in the mid to late 60s. They were a momentous time in America, and they did a lot of good, but it is the individuals that stand out more than the movement. Many place the beginning of the civil rights movement as far back as the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, which launched a young and unknown Martin Luther King Jr. to the leadership of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association. What sparked the creation of this movement was, of course, The actions of Rosa Parks, refusing to move from her seat in favour of standing white folk. She was arrested for this and charged with the violation of Chapter 6, Section 11 of the Montgomery City Code. It's a well-known story, and her name is still taught in schools today, and honoured all over. She was an individual, acting as an individual, and that lit the touch paper that launched MLK into the spotlight, and eventually led to the whole civil rights explosion in the 60s. One person, not a group, one person captured the imagination. So why do we see most protests nowadays as major rallies with hundreds or thousands of people? That's the question. Why have we accepted larger, ineffectual protests over individual sacrifices that historically have made the real difference? You see, protests of today are more complex and, shockingly, a lot more manufactured than we in a free society would hope for. There's something called controlled spontaneity, which for those of you who place a high value on liberty may come as somewhat of a surprise. It's the process by which the actual government decides to manage a crisis. They have people working on, quote, grassroots responses to incidents, terror attacks, and any number of situations that may upset the apple cart, that may upset the status quo. And these campaigns are ready to roll out at a moment's notice. They have hashtags already designed. They have social media teams ready to flood the internet, not only to shape public discourse, but also to provide the news media with the crux of their stories. For example, following the London Bridge terror attacks in 2017, a group of men in an unmarked van were allowed to walk past the police cordon and start putting up signs that had hashtags Turn to Love, For London, and Love Will Win. This was a sealed area controlled by anti-terrorism police officers, and these people could just walk past their lines and start putting up posters. These hashtags would later form the rallying call of several supposedly grassroots solidarity events. An anonymous Home Office employee stated that after the Arab Spring uprising, the British government was so terrified that something similar could happen on British soil, and so they set up these mind control operations. He said, quote, "This job has changed significantly from planning for organic people responses to tragedy to being told, we would like the people to do that. How do you get them there? A lot of public responses are spontaneous, of course, but a lot are shaped. The British government doesn't want spontaneity, it wants controlled spontaneity." End quote. It seems almost every day there are protests. Every day, organised groups with professionally designed slogans and signs, paid for by someone, fill our streets, and we, the regular Joes and Jills of the public, we feel that change is in the air, because people are marching for their beliefs. But it's a myth. It's a concocted fantasy that ties into the very leftish idea that group action, working as a collective, is the most appropriate response, more so than rugged individualism. And never once questioning whether these protests are stage-managed, affairs designed to catch our eye and distract us from the fact that nothing ever really changes. It's the individual that has the real power in society. It's the individual acting for what they believe that affects change, that becomes the real change agent. All the rest, the screaming, the virtue signalling, the media-friendly websites and petitions, they're all but smoke and mirrors to subdue, control, and to keep you sat at home glued to the tube in the belief that someone is actually doing something. Thank you for listening to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Join us next episode, where we'll be talking more history, politics, legends and stories. Until next time, thanks for listening.